with Brown and Company. I'm the managing partner of our firm. Thanks for coming today. This is a second meeting in a series of 3 on what we call the fall lecture series. And what we listen for when we're talking to our clients is if there's anything that we hear or questions that we hear, more than, a few times. And then what we always say is that if a couple of clients are thinking about something or asking us about it, then a lot more are thinking about it. So it was around those comments and questions that we've been getting that we came up with our topics for the three meetings. So this one today is on the potential legislative changes to taxes and estate planning based on how the election goes. And so we have with us today an expert with American Funds and Capital Group. Her name is Leslie Geller, and she's a trained estate lawyer. She's not a lawyer any longer, but she was a partner with an LA law firm. You'll have to tell us which one, Leslie. And now works with Capital Group. And you all often hear me say too, be careful who you listen to, because if you're listening to, people that are right, then you're going to have better results, as time goes by, and vice versa. So we're very careful who we listen to. And Capital Group and American Funds were formed in 1931, so just after the Depression, and was one of the first mutual funds started in 1934 in the country. It's a very successful firm. They have over $2 trillion in assets under management, managed by 326 investment professionals. So anybody that that works with a group like American Funds and Capital Group, we believe knows what they're talking about. So I'm gonna then turn this over to, just a couple of things. I know a lot of you that are on the call today were on our last call, so I won't talk quite as long or about it as much. But for the people that weren't on that call last time, just to say that our clients are having a really good year this year from a money management standpoint. We ended up making some changes about a year ago to the portfolio that have benefited us during this tricky year, say the least. And that's one thing. The other thing is that we decided after, I think, 33 years to move from downtown Denver to Cherry Creek in a brand new building right at 2nd and Fillmore. So we're excited about that. We're hoping to move in by the spring. But just one more thing is just that with all the things that are going around right now, the election and worldwide pandemic and social unrest, just know that we're here and working for you every day, and that will never change. So anyway, with that, I'll turn it over to Chad, who's our Director of Practice Management. As you may remember, Chad worked for me 20 years ago for about 10 years, and then he left the firm for about 10 years to get some other experience, and he's been back with us now for about 2 years. So he's done a lot of things to add a lot of positivity to our company. With that, I'll switch it to you, Chad.
Thanks, Mark.
I'm gonna get off camera just because I prefer to do so, but I'll still be here, and I'll come back, at the end, or if I'm asked a question. Thanks, Chad.
Yep. Thanks, Mark. One thing too, just a quick note in terms of logistics. If you have any questions, you can type those into the control panel there where it says Q&A. There's a little box. You can open that up and type in questions at any point along the way. And then when we're done with kind of the prepared discussion, with Leslie and I. Then we'll open it up to whatever questions come up. So we would love to hear from you if you have any thoughts, want us to clarify anything that we don't cover that you want to talk about, just let us know, and we'll do our best to address those at the end. Okay, so from a historical perspective, US presidents haven't really had as much impact on the economy as most people tend to think. Our economy is, at least it has been from any historical analysis, bigger than any single president. But when it comes to taxes, presidents actually have had a pretty significant impact, especially for more affluent individuals. So we think it makes sense to examine what each candidate has at least said they want to do and look at their proposals. But before we even get into that, Leslie, I want to start by acknowledging that no matter what happens in the election next month, there are some big changes that are scheduled to happen to tax legislation in a few years. So can you speak to that just a little bit in terms of the sunset provisions, and what can we expect to happen if there are no changes that are legislated even between now and then?
Yeah, that's a really important point to make. And I think it's a great place to start because it takes a little bit of a step back from the politics of it all, or at least the emotional politics of it all at the moment. Um, when Trump passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017, it was that big piece of tax legislation that was signed into law at the end of 2017, took effect. First year was in 2018. As part of that legislation, for various budgetary reasons, a lot of the provisions in there had to be only temporary, which means they had to have these sunset provisions indicated. So they basically had to expire at certain points in the future. And all these various provisions have certain sunset time periods, right? So they weren't passed as part of the tax code, right? They were passed as these temporary changes. One of the biggest examples that I'm sure a lot of people on this call have heard about is that sunset of the lifetime exemption amount for that estate and gift tax, right? So we have two systems. We have the income tax system, we have the transfer tax system. Transfer tax system is comprised of the estate tax, the gift tax, and the generation skipping transfer tax. So we currently have this lifetime exemption amount of 11.58 million, which means during life or at death, you can pass up to $11.58 million without the imposition of a gift or estate tax, right? It's called the lifetime exemption. Um, how that plays into the sunset is that that was one of those temporary increases passed as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That $11.58 million number is set to sunset at the end of 2025 and go back to the pre-2017 Tax Act number, which is 5 million plus inflation. So it will probably, if it's left to sunset, it will probably go down to about between 5.5 and 6. So we're going to go from an 11.58 million exemption amount per person to about a 5.5 million exemption per person. So I've heard a lot of these sunset provisions called legislating by default, right? It's like legislation by default that these provisions, and they're in the corporate tax, they're in the individual income tax realm, they're set to expire at these times in the future, and just letting them happen by default is effectively changing tax laws. So that's why it's been called legislating by default.
Right, and a tax increase by default. And so what this means, I think, for a lot of people who are not currently subject to a taxable estate, at least at the federal level, is that many of them have to contend with federal estate taxes a few years from now. So for those who are motivated to minimize estate taxes, what should they be thinking about it, at least at a high level? How should they be thinking about what to do given changes on the horizon at some point?
Right. So the first thing is that we have this, like you said, this impending sunset, which means that even if nobody does anything, we're going to have a much larger cross section of the mass affluent, high net worth population who is going to have to start thinking about tax efficient wealth transfer. So that's a really big change. And that is what's coming down the pipe if nobody does anything. We also have this additional complexity around what would happen if we had a Democratic president, right? And especially if we have a Democratic Senate, because the Democrats have proposed changes in this estate tax realm. So both in the income tax system and the estate tax system or the transfer tax system. So they are proposing changes that will impact wealth transfer, not just in the transfer tax system, but also in the income tax system. So a couple of thoughts here just on what the Democrats have proposed. So up until last week, I had been telling people that the Democrats had been relatively silent on what they would do with the estate tax, right? The changes they would make to the transfer tax system. Everyone assumed that silence was simply an affirmation that they were just going to let it sunset. If they were elected, if they were able to pass tax legislation, that legislation wouldn't really include anything that directly impacted the estate tax, right? That they would just let it go down to that $5.5 million exemption amount back in, or at the end of 2025. What's come out over the last couple weeks is that there are some rumblings that part of the policy, part of the proposal could be a reduction of that lifetime exemption amount down to $3.5 million. And perhaps an even further reduction of the gift tax exemption amount, so the amount you can give away during life, to $1 million. So there are rumblings that it might just not be letting the current status quo sunset, but proactively making changes to the estate tax or the transfer tax system that would impact this lifetime exemption. Now, the complexity here is that a lot of the Democrats and the Republicans' proposals have been pretty vague on details. So a lot of these policy assumptions are coming from a place of assumptions. Like that's the best way to think of them. But I am reading more about that in the last couple of weeks. So the important thing here is, even though we don't know what is going to happen with the elections, with this legislation around wealth transfer, we do know what we have now, which is this big exemption amount, right? We have 11.58 million per person. And so what we've been encouraging clients to do is, if making a gift makes sense anyways, so not just from a tax perspective, if it makes sense from a holistic financial planning perspective, there is no reason not to do it now. There's no harm in doing it now. There could be harm in waiting until next year because we don't know what's going to happen with the elections. We don't even know when we're going to know the results of the elections. So waiting until next year brings about this whole other level of uncertainty when it comes to transfer taxes and wealth transfer. Whereas if you take advantage of what you have now, which is this big lifetime exemption, assuming it makes sense, not just from a tax perspective, but from a holistic financial planning perspective, there's no harm in doing it now.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just so you know, everyone, up on the screen that I'm sharing is it's just kind of a top 10 list of planning ideas to consider from the Capital Group, American Funds, and in there is a heavy emphasis on gifting. You don't have to be able to read all this right now. That's not why I'm putting it up there, but we will share the slides when we're done, and so there is some of that in there. But Leslie, you bring up a good point. I mean, gifting is, I think, the single, in terms of an umbrella strategy, like probably the best thing to do when it comes to estate planning, to the extent that someone has the ability to gift and the willingness to do so. Probably sooner is better, because we don't know what's going to happen, except it sure looks like the gift exclusion amounts and the taxation, all of that is going to be less favorable going forward. So if we know the what, in terms of gifting, big picture, can we talk a little bit about how? Like, can you describe, when we think about gifting, what are some of the best practices about how to gift, whether it's real estate or a business interest or whatever it might be? Kind of speak a little bit more to ownership structure and those kinds of logistics when it comes to a good gifting strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chad, I'm glad you put this piece up on the screen, because the best thing about this piece, and this was very deliberate, is that everything on it makes sense no matter what happens with the elections, right? These are all things to be thinking about, irrespective of what goes on in the next couple of months. So it's a great just checklist to review before the end of the year. So I think that's always a great thing to point out, is that there's no, if this person wins or if the Senate flips this way, this is what you should be thinking about. These are just things that are great things to consider before the end of the year, irrespective of what happens in the next couple months.
Mhm.
So, gifting. So I always started, when I was an estate planning attorney, even with clients who were in that ultra high net worth space, we would always start with the simple gifting techniques. And sometimes these get overlooked because they're so simple, but oftentimes they're the best way to start, right? I would call them gateway gifting techniques. They're also very, very effective for a lot of families. So examples of that: the annual exclusion gift. The annual exclusion gift is different from that lifetime exemption amount. I'm sure a lot of people on this call are familiar with that $15,000 per year per person that you can give away to as many people as you like. And that renews every year. When you make an annual exclusion gift, even if you make 25 of them, you don't technically have to file a gift tax return. So it's administratively really easy. It's also a very effective way if you have a big family, right? Think about a grandparent who has a few kids, a bunch of grandkids, kids are married, some of the grandkids are married. You can move a lot of money or a lot of value, if you're making gifts other than cash, on a regular basis with just the annual exclusion gift. So that can be really powerful. The other really simple gifting technique that gets overlooked is the direct payment of tuition and medical expenses. So if you pay for a grandchild's private school, if you pay for a grandchild's college tuition, assuming you make the payment directly to the institution, that is treated as effectively a nothing for gift tax purposes. You don't even have to file a gift tax return. When you think about the cost of private school right now, the cost of college tuition, that can be a very, very effective way to lower your taxable estate, which, when you're talking about the estate tax, when you're talking about tax efficient wealth transfer, is really the ultimate goal with gifting, is to lower the value of your taxable estate at death, so you have less of a tax base that will be subject to the estate tax upon your death. So those are the simple gifting techniques. Some of the other techniques that maybe you've heard of are those techniques that transfer not the value of an asset, but the future appreciation on an asset. Because think about it, if you give an asset just in a simple gift, right, to a trust for your kids or directly to a child, you're not only giving away the value of that asset now, you're giving away the future appreciation on that asset. Because now that that asset is no longer yours, not only will that asset not be included in your estate, but the future appreciation also won't be part of your taxable estate. And so, just as a general matter, the best assets to gift, the most leverage you get from making that gift, are those assets that are going to appreciate significantly after you make that gift. Right now, with interest rates so low, there are a couple of gifting techniques that transfer only the appreciation on an asset. So they don't transfer the current value of the asset, they transfer the future appreciation on an asset. So they're really effective for assets that are going to jump in value. So think about a startup interest, right? The startup's going to go through a big capital event at some point. So it's going to blow up in value. Think about something that in the last several months has declined in value, but is expected to bounce back. An energy stock, some sort of travel industry stock. If you think that's expected to bounce back, they can be great assets to use to move the appreciation out of your estate. Some of the techniques that you may have heard of, grantor retained annuity trust, a GRAT. A similar technique is a sale to a defective grantor trust. Those are both techniques that transfer only the appreciation on an asset, and they are very, very effective in low interest rate environments. So we're seeing those all over the place, especially for assets that are expected to jump in value or maybe have declined in value but are expected to rebound. Just as a general matter, again, I said one of the main goals with gifting is to get the most bang for your buck when it comes to using up your lifetime exemption, right? Or your annual exclusion for that matter. So if you have $11.58 million of exemption like we do right now, it can be great to move $11.58 million worth of cash, right? But it could be even better to move a business interest or a piece of real estate, because you've got not only the value you're transferring, but also the future appreciation on that asset, which can be quite significant. So the selection of the asset you're gifting can really make an impact on the leverage you get from using your exemption amount.
Yeah, that's good. And I think all of that's helpful. When we think about gifting, one of the things that we say often is you don't, even though it can make a lot of sense from a tax perspective, we always want to make sure that we don't jeopardize someone's financial security and retirement security by doing too much and getting too fancy with gifting, and then gifting away assets that they might need to support their own living in retirement. So we've developed what we call a retirement shock absorber, and that's designed to identify the amount of capital available that's needed to cover the total capital need, and then also provide a cushion. So anything beyond that amount that we identify as the core need is something that we identify in the planning that is available for gifting purposes. And so that's just, I just want to bring it back to the framework of what a lot of our clients on the call are used to seeing, and just think in terms of that surplus capital, if you can picture that. And that's always a pretty straightforward part of our analysis that we are always obviously happy to do. So let's talk about, I think when it comes to proposed tax changes, I think it's fair to say there's quite a bit of familiarity with the Republican side. We had the tax legislation that was passed just a couple years ago, so we know more or less what the thinking is there, and so I don't know that we need to get into that too much. But if on the Democratic side, there are a number of things, and I know you've touched on a lot of these. I guess, and we can open it up to any of these bullet points that you want to mention, Leslie, but there is one in particular that I think is potentially really really big, and I don't know how many people are thinking about this or aware of this, but the elimination of the step up in cost basis for states that are transferred on to heirs. I think that's at least one of these bullet points that we want to touch on. So can you help us unpack that a little bit in terms of what that means?
Yep. And that kind of goes together with the eliminate the stepped up cost basis and the tax unrealized capital gains at death. Those kind of go together. So right now, under current law, if you die with an asset in your estate, you are afforded the step up in basis to fair market value at the time of your death. So I'll give you an example. If I own an apartment building that I purchased a long time ago for $100,000, and that apartment building is now worth $10 million, right? It's in an area that's been gentrified. It's now worth $10 million. I have a really low basis asset. If I were to go and sell that asset, there would be a really big income tax bill because of all that built-in gain. However, under current law, if I hold on to that asset until death, I would get a step up in income tax basis upon death to fair market value before it went to my beneficiaries, my children or grandchildren. So assuming fair market value is 10 million upon death, that value gets stepped up in basis, right, to $10 million. So I am now passing on to my children an asset that is worth $10 million and also has a $10 million basis. The benefit there is that if they then go and sell that asset, they will have little, if any, income tax consequences because the fair market value of the asset, $10 million, is equivalent to the basis, $10 million. So there's a huge tax benefit in holding on to those low basis assets until death because of that step up. What the Democrats are proposing is a big change in this area. And it's really interesting because it hits the transfer of wealth from generation to generation, right? It's an income tax proposal that implicates wealth transfer, which was usually or has been currently relegated to the transfer tax system, the estate and gift tax system. What the Democrats are proposing is that upon death, if I die with that asset worth $10 million that has a $100,000 basis, I don't get a step up in basis upon death without a cost. So what happens is I am treated as if I sold that asset upon my death, even though I haven't, and my estate is forced to pay the income tax on those built-in gains. So on that $9.9 million worth of gain, my estate, my beneficiaries have to bear the burden of the income tax on that gain. No longer do they get to take that asset at a $10 million basis and then sell it at effectively no income tax cost. So it's an income tax proposal that really, really implicates wealth transfer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I like how you you explained that. So, if you start to strategize on various methods of wealth transfer, you often do have to decide whether your main goal is to reduce income taxes on the one hand, or estate taxes on the other. Just like you were talking about in terms of basis, and it's an income tax issue within the broader realm of estate planning. So can you talk a little bit more about income tax versus estate tax trade-offs in
Yep.
transferring wealth?
Yeah, so I always referred to it when I would talk to clients as the pick your poison conversation. And it would come up in the context of a lot of times with families who had these legacy assets, right? This legacy stock position that they'd owned forever that had effectively zero basis, or this interest in a business that they've built that has effectively zero basis, right? So highly appreciated assets with a lot of built-in gain just sitting there. So we would have this pick your poison conversation, and we would say, okay, we'll stick with this, $10 million piece of real estate that has a $100,000 basis. So we would discuss with them, okay, do you want to deal with the estate tax, right? So address the estate tax, use up 10 million of your lifetime exemption, give away that asset worth $10 million to a trust for your kids or grandkids. That's great from an estate tax perspective because you've gotten $10 million of value out of your estate plus any future appreciation, right? So that's a good thing. You've accomplished your estate tax goals. The downside is you're leaving your beneficiaries with an income tax problem because gifts take a carryover basis. So if you give that asset during life to a trust for your kids or grandkids, they have an asset worth $10 million with a $100,000 basis. So if they want to go and sell it, they're going to have a big income tax bill, okay? The alternative, the other side of the pick your poison conversation is let's deal with the income tax and leave children, grandchildren with an estate tax problem. So same asset, I hold on to it until death. I get that step up in basis. I pass it on to my kids, grandkids, a trust for their benefit. They get $10 million asset with a $10 million basis. You've solved their income tax problem. The problem is that asset was included in my estate upon death. So it's part of my taxable estate. So if I've already used up all of my exemption amount, right, then I have an estate tax problem. And my beneficiaries or my estate is going to be left with an estate tax bill if I am over that lifetime exemption amount, or if I've used it all during life. So that's the pick your poison conversation. In the last few years, because that lifetime exemption amount that applies to the gift and estate tax has been so high, most of those conversations have skewed very much towards the let's deal with the income tax by holding on to that asset until death, getting the step up in basis, because we're not that worried about the estate tax because the exemption amount is so high. So it was really only couples who had, you know, $22, $23 million plus as their net estate or as their estate that had to worry about the estate tax. So it's very much the conversation skewed towards addressing the income tax, doing the income tax planning by holding on to that asset until death, right? And leaving the estate tax to deal as a problem, but it wasn't really a problem because the lifetime exemption amount was so high. What we're seeing in the last few months is that that conversation has really shifted for a couple of reasons. First of all, because the Democrats are proposing this change to the rules around the step up in basis upon death and that forced recognition of gain, right? We don't know what's going to happen. That cornerstone of planning, that step up in basis upon death, has really been called into question. We also have uncertainty around what's going to happen with the lifetime exemption amount, right? So we may not have an 11.58 million exemption next year or the year after. So the idea of let's just use up the estate tax exemption while we have it because we're no longer guaranteed this benefit on the income tax side if we hold it until death. So we're seeing a big shift towards let's deal with the estate tax, address that because that's a known thing. We know what we're doing there. We know the benefit we get at the expense of having some uncertainty around the income tax.
Yeah, makes sense. There are a couple questions that came in, so I'm going to pivot to those just to make sure we have time for them. The first one, and this is a good one. So they said, is there any chance that the current gift tax exclusion, the 11.58 million, will be pulled back into a person's estate if the gift and estate tax exemption is lowered to that $5 million level? And I think it's getting to, concern about a potential clawback, as it's referred to often, or will gifting that takes advantage of that be grandfathered in? Presumably, I think if this were to happen, say next year, right? Because there's that would be the earliest time at which we could see some changes in the law.
Yeah, so the IRS effectively came out last year and said that they can't do that they can't do a clawback. So that is pretty firmly settled. And that's mostly because it becomes a constitutional issue, right? A question of relying on certain law, right? Effectively using an asset that you are given as a citizen of the United States and a taxpayer, and then having that asset taken away from you in the future, right? That's a constitutional issue. So the IRS came out last year and effectively said, we can't do that. We won't do that. It also, from a practical perspective, would be an absolute administrative nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you tried to come back, think about somebody who used all their exemption, gave it away. If you tried to come back, or the IRS tried to come back later and say, nope, you only had 5 million of exemption, so we're going to claw back 6 million of that and now you owe tax on it, who do they go after? Do they go after the grantor? Do they go after the beneficiaries? What if nobody has any money left to pay the tax? So it's not just the constitutional issue, it's also just practically rather impossible.
Right. It's good. Another question, it says, how best to transfer an interest in a 401k? And I think we could broaden this and say even just IRAs, qualified assets, are definitely tax disadvantaged when we think about wealth transfer. So any insights there that you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is we're starting to see, you know, clients who have substantial retirement assets, right? They're sitting ducks for tax purposes, right? Because they are subject to both the income tax and the estate tax.
Hmm.
So those assets, you can't make gifts of them during your life, right? While they're sitting there in qualified accounts, they're literally just sitting there waiting to be subject to tax. So what we're seeing is with all the uncertainty in the income tax space, or this, I guess, the certainty that irrespective of who's in power, taxes are likely not going down because of the amount of money the federal government is spending, the states are spending, right? Just from a practical perspective.
Hmm.
So if you expect that income tax rates are likely headed upwards, we have all of this uncertainty around what could happen with the estate tax and the lifetime exemption amount. We're seeing clients who have significant retirement assets choose to accelerate the tax consequences on those assets to effectively just lock in the situation they have now, prepay the taxes that their beneficiaries would otherwise be left with, right? And then sometimes put those assets to work from a wealth transfer perspective. So something as simple as a Roth conversion, right? And a really big Roth conversion, right? Where you pay all that, you turn a regular IRA into a Roth by paying the income tax on it. You're accomplishing a few things. You're locking in the current tax rate. You're taking on the tax burden that would otherwise be your beneficiary's burden. We also have another force at play because of the Secure Act, right? That big piece of legislation that went into effect this year. The biggest change there from a planning perspective was that loss of the inherited stretch IRA and the transition to the 10-year rule. So it used to be you could pass on a retirement account to children or grandchildren. They could stretch the distribution and thus the tax on that account over their life expectancy. Now, most non-spouse beneficiaries have to distribute and pay the tax on that entire retirement account 10 years from the account owner's death. That's a really big change. There are big planning and tax effects there. So that's another one of those factors that's coming into play when people are choosing to accelerate income taxes on these big retirement accounts, because they're choosing to lock in their current rates and effectively take that tax burden, which is even more than it used to be because of the Secure Act, off of their beneficiaries. We're also seeing, even beyond that Roth conversion, if somebody is over 59 and a half, they're choosing to pull large amounts out of their qualified accounts, take the tax hit, and then, as I said, put those assets to work from a wealth transfer perspective, whether that's using those net assets, the post-tax assets, to make gifts to younger generations, or to, one thing I keep seeing, using those assets to fund a life insurance policy. Life insurance is one of those, as I've told you guys many times, one of those ever favored tax vehicles that is, provides that tax deferred growth. The proceeds are not subject to income tax. And if it's held inside an insurance trust, it's also not subject to estate tax. So for clients who have substantial retirement assets, instead of just, defaulting to that attitude, which has been par for the course of deferring income for as long as possible, they're choosing, because of all these forces we have at play, to accelerate the income just so they can do some more effective planning for their future, for future generations.
Right. And I guess in a really ideal example is if you've got a large enough IRA and you have to take required minimum distributions, if those distributions happen to be able to pay the premiums for the life insurance policy, then that could work out pretty well
Yep,
also. And then of course, um, it's probably the single best asset for a charitable
exactly.
beneficiary, right? I mean,
Yep,
if nothing else, that's the easiest way to deal with it for those that are so inclined to carve out a charitable piece for their estate.
absolutely.
Um, all right. Well, I think maybe just one more thing before we wrap it up. And that is, we talked about a lot about on the individual side, the Democratic proposals for tax policy. Do you want to just touch on the corporate income tax piece and what might be involved there if we see Democratic leadership in DC?
Yeah, so this one's really interesting, I think, because so much of the press has been around the individual income tax increases. But first, the big one is that the Democrats want to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%. And that's from 21%, which went into effect with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Before that, it was 35%. So the Democrats kind of picked that middle ground, right? They picked somewhere in the middle. There's also a couple of changes around getting after those corporations or those businesses that have taken advantage of having subsidiaries offshore, right, or operations offshore. They've been able to not shelter, but avoid US income tax on certain income produced by those offshore operations. There are some proposals to address that. Also, one of the big ones is this 15% tax on book income. And what that is effectively, if you think about that as taxable income is different from book income. Taxable income gets the benefits of all of those deductions that we see, right? NOLs, investment deductions. This 15% tax on book income would be a tax on the income before you get the benefit of all of those deductions. So that could be a serious revenue producer in itself. There's a couple of other changes too, a bunch of other changes proposed. As with the individual income tax increases or proposals, it's very light on details. There are some policymakers, some experts in this area who thinks this type of thing or the corporate tax proposals and what happens with them as far as legislation goes, those are the ones that are going to be more impactful on the markets and the economy. But as with the individual income tax increases, we really don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty in that space. I think with all these tax increases, procedurally, if we have that blue wave scenario, right? Procedurally, tax legislation could be very easy to pass because they could do it through the budget reconciliation process. So all that requires is the simple majority vote. They could avoid that third rail filibuster issue. Procedurally, it's very easy, but I think what we often lose sight of is politically how difficult it could be to get a lot of these really big changes through, even if you do have that blue wave scenario. So there are moderates on both sides, and there are a lot of people who think that if we have this big shifting and changing when it comes to the White House and the makeup of the Senate, that there may be more room for moderation. Again, who knows if we've learned anything over the last few years, that anything can happen. But I've been really trying to counsel advisors and clients to avoid being terrified about all of these potential changes.
I think that's a good way to close this one out. So thank you, Leslie. And that was really good. I appreciate everything you covered. I think I would hope that everyone on the call has at least one or two takeaways from what you talked about. Mark, do you have any closing thoughts for us?
Sure. First, I want to thank Leslie and Roger for talking to our clients today. It was very good and very understandable, which is in your area of expertise is sometimes you can really be inside baseball. So thanks for breaking it down for us. And then I'd say, as is always true, everybody's situation is different. So the main thing about today's discussion was just to pique your interest in things that we could talk about over the next couple months. It might be things you've been thinking about anyway, and now maybe this talk might help us come closer to making some sort of decision. So anyway, I'm grateful, Chad, that you put it all together. And do we have any other questions or anything that either one of you want to say before we conclude?
I don't have anything else, and no other questions have come through.
All right. Well, what you want to tell us about the next program, Chad?
Yeah. So up on this slide, you'll see the next session is next Monday at 2:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And we will be talking about risks and opportunities for investing in light of the upcoming election, and look at a few different scenarios there. So we will have a portfolio manager from Wellington, a $1 trillion money manager, and so we're looking forward to that. I hope you can join us. And as always, we're recording these. So if you ever want to check out one of these sessions that, let's say you missed the first one and you want to see it, you just go to brownandco.com/election, and we will be posting the replays there. We'll have a replay of this one available by tomorrow on that site. Yeah, so that's it for me.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.